What I figured out today about the barber blew my mind. And I promise you, I am not baiting you, and you'll be glad you watched this. I'll make you a deal. If you watch this whole video and feel I baited you, give it a downvote. If you feel like I did not bait you, give it an upvote. Now, some say the barber is so overpowered that it is breaking the game literally. Others say that it has a lot of negatives and it's actually bad. We are going to take a deep dive and look at all of the interactions of the barber, and trust me, you'll want to stay to the end to hear about all these weird mechanics, as certain skills get bricked completely, while others work just fine. And by the end of the video, you'll know what to keep in your builds, what to take out, and what you'll need to test. First off, let's quickly go over how the barber works so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll get into the weird mechanics. The way the barber works is that when you critical hit a mob, that mob starts to absorb all of the damage that it's taking, including damage from teammates. And then after 2 to 4 seconds, it then explodes for some amount of amplified damage based on how long it was absorbing damage for. For example, if it absorbed damage for 1 second, then you would get an extra 14% damage. 2 seconds, 28% damage. 4 seconds, 56% damage. And this essentially turns all of your single target damage into AoE damage as it explodes onto the enemies around it, including itself. And this is extremely powerful. Now, during the time that the barber is absorbing all of this damage, lots of weird things happen with skills. What works and what does not work during this time. Many have rumored that anything with a lucky hit does not work with Barber, and this is actually not true. It actually goes much deeper than that, and I did some testing on some skills and then looked for patterns. Let's see if you can figure out those same patterns. Here are some aspects and a skill that do not work when the Barber is applied. So take a moment, if you'd like, pause the video and see what you notice. Do you notice any patterns? Let's go over it. Okay, so what I notice is that here, for example, Blast Trapper says dealing direct damage to enemies. Manglers says dealing direct damage to a vulnerable enemy. And Exposure also says dealing direct damage. So skills that mention dealing direct damage don't work because, well, we're not able to apply direct damage while it's absorbing the damage. Now, Umbrus and Enhanced Heartseeker, notice they both say critical strikes. And that makes sense too, because if you critical strike with the Barber, then it starts absorbing damage, so it's not able to apply these effects as well. And one thing I'll point out is notice that Enhanced Heartseeker is not a lucky hit, and it still gets affected. So it's not just lucky hits that can be affected by this. And now, what we have here are a bunch of skills that all work during Barber. So again, if you'd like, take a moment, pause the video, see what you notice. Now, we'll go over it. Okay, so what I notice here is that, for example, Clip Shot, it says in order to activate the skill, it just says a Cutthroat skill, or here it says a marksman skill to knock back enemies. So here we're not actually having to apply damage, we just have to use a skill. And similarly here with Cold Imbuement, it's a lucky hit, but it says Cold Imbued skills have up to a 40% chance to make enemies vulnerable. So this is a great way to apply vulnerable during the absorption phase. And then Subverting Stealth also says the skill that breaks concealment always makes enemies vulnerable for 6 seconds. So again, here it mentions the skill not doing damage. And notice these two, Puncture and Forceful Arrow, they mention casts. So every third cast, every third cast. So here it's not about, again, doing damage, it's just about making a cast. And one thing to notice is that this is actually interesting because for rogues, Puncture ends up not working, but Forceful Arrow does work to apply vulnerable. And for that reason, I think Forceful Arrow could potentially creep its way into the meta this season for Barber users. Now, that being said, it seems very cut and dry, right? If it's something that has to do with damage, dealing direct damage, critical strike, it doesn't work. Well, if you mentioned things like skills and casts, it does work. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, it seems. So here I found some examples that do not work, and here I found some examples that do work. And again, take a moment if you'd like, pause the video now, and see what you notice. And now we'll go over it now. So here we have fundamental puncture, which is the skill that rogues use to apply vulnerable. This unfortunately doesn't work. And notice the verbiage is it says hitting an enemy. And you might think, well, that makes sense. Can't really hit it during the absorb phase. But unfortunately over here, we have misery, which says when you hit a crowd controlled enemy, and this does work. So this phrasing of hitting is not real clear. It's not real consistent. Similarly, there's some verbiage here. For example, Icy Alchemist says damaging a chilled or frozen enemy, or exploit, the glyph that everyone uses, says when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This does not work. And unfortunately, this also doesn't work even on the first hit if it crits. So if you get a critical strike on your first hit, then it's not going to apply vulnerable, and you're not going to have vulnerable up for that whole absorb phase. So this is pretty unfortunate. Okay. And close quarters combat, damaging a close enemy. Again, this is very sad for me because I like this skill a lot, but unfortunately it doesn't work. Okay. And here we have enhanced blade shift, damaging an enemy. This one does work, as well as invigorating strike, damaging a crowd control enemy does work. So this phrasing of damaging an enemy or hitting an enemy is not consistent, unfortunately. I think you just have to go test them one at a time. If you guys notice something that I'm missing here, let me know. Let's briefly recap this, and then we're going to look at, is it better to use a 2-second barber or a 4-second barber? What doesn't work are effects from things like critical strikes or dealing direct damage from all of my testing thus far. If you find exceptions to this, let me know. And what does work is things that mention on skill use or on cast effects. And what seems to be inconsistent is things that mention hitting or damaging or doing damage. And again, lucky hit has nothing to do with it, even though lucky hit effects oftentimes have these above words in them very frequently. Regular skills can be affected as well that use similar verbiage. Now, another thing that people oftentimes wonder about is, do I want a low duration barber or do I want a long duration barber? So there are pros and cons of each. So if you have a 4-second barber, then you're going to get a 56% damage increase versus a 2-second barber, you're going to get a 28% damage increase at level 4. Now, you might think, well, that seems pretty obvious. Go with the 4-second barber then. Well, there is a pro to consider with the 2-second barber, which is that it may allow you a chance to reapply certain effects more frequently that may not work while barbered. For example, if you're using puncture, that doesn't work while barbered, so maybe it doesn't work the first time, so then once it procs the explosion, well, then you have another chance to apply vulnerable. Another thing that people are oftentimes concerned about is, if I have a long 4-second barber, am I going to get stuck hitting some low health mob for 4 seconds that I could have just one-shot? And the answer to that is no, because it's only going to absorb the damage until the absorbed damage reaches the mob's max health, and then it will explode. For example, if a mob has 500 health, once you do 500 damage to it, it explodes. It doesn't matter if you haven't reached the 4 seconds yet. And this helps a ton with speed farming, since you don't get stuck hitting those low health mobs for 4 seconds that you'd otherwise one-shot. And this helps a ton with speed farming, since you don't get stuck hitting those low health mobs for 4 seconds that you'd otherwise one-shot. So is the barber right for your build? Well, I can't make that decision for you, but you now have a lot of information to help you decide. So good luck, and I hope you didn't forget our deal. Bye-bye.